For over 40 years, Angola was locked in conflict. Following a war for independence, it was plunged into one of the most brutal civil wars of modern times. In addition to a fight for control between local factions, the country became a centre of superpower rivalries as the United States, Soviet Union, Cuba and South Africa were all drawn in to what became a devastating armed confrontation. But just how did a struggle to end colonisation spiral into decades of warfare that left millions dead and displaced and profoundly changed Africa? Hello and welcome. If you're new to the channel, my name is James Ker-Lindsay, and here I take an informed look at international relations, conflict, security and statehood. We tend to think of the Cold War as a confrontation between the two superpowers and their allies that never escalated into direct armed conflict. Indeed, the term Cold War deliberately separates it from the usual form of hot, militarised confrontations. And yet, in truth, the Cold War was far from peaceful. Over 4.5 decades, many wars and conflicts emerged as local proxies for the United States and the Soviet Union fought for control across Africa, Asia and Latin America. One of the best examples is the Angolan Civil War. Emerging from a decade-long anti-colonial quest for independence, it became one of Africa's most prolonged and brutal conflicts. As local forces fought each other, outside powers, including the United States and the Soviet Union, became deeply involved, turning the country's war into one of the most significant, deadly and devastating Cold War proxy conflicts. The Republic of Angola is located in southwestern Africa. At approximately 1.25 million square kilometres, or around 480,000 square miles, it's the continent's 7th largest country. Namibia borders it to the south, Zambia lies to its east, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo is to the north. The Atlantic Ocean lies to the country's west. Today, the population is around 36 million and is divided into 3 predominant ethnic groups: the Ovimbundu, the Ambundu and the Bakongo. The country is also rich in natural resources. In addition to oil and diamonds, which have long underpinned the economy, it has significant reserves of other minerals, including iron ore, copper and gold. Angola has a long and rich history. Once home to several significant African kingdoms, our story really starts in the late 15th century when European explorers first arrived along the country's Atlantic coast. By the 16th century, Portugal had established a foothold. This would have devastating consequences as Angola became a central hub of the Portuguese transatlantic slave trade. Over the following centuries, millions of Angolans were forcibly taken to colonies such as Brazil. Although Portuguese control initially remained confined to coastal areas, relying on alliances with local kingdoms, by the late 19th century the slave trade had been abolished and Portugal began expanding inland. As the European scramble for Africa unfolded, Portugal strengthened its authority over the entire country. And by the start of the 20th century, it completely controlled Angola, profiting from the country's vast economic wealth and subjecting the local population to harsh colonial rule. While most European colonial powers began to decolonise after the end of the Second World War, Portugal refused to give up its overseas territories. With its rich natural resources and fertile land, Angola was simply too vital to Portugal's economic interests. As a result, in 1956, urban intellectuals and left-leaning activists founded the Marxist-oriented Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, the MPLA. This drew its support primarily from the Mbundu, the country's second largest ethnic group, as well as from urban elites. As it pressed for an end to colonial rule, the group sought international backing from the Soviet Union and other socialist countries. Meanwhile, as anger steadily grew over continued Portuguese colonial rule, 2 uprisings emerged in 1961. The first saw plantation workers protest about harsh labour practices. Following this, Angolan nationalists attacked prisons and administrative buildings. As Portuguese forces brutally suppressed both rebellions, the Angolan War of Indepnedence began. As widespread opposition to Portuguese colonial rule now took hold, 2 more groups would emerge. The first was the National Front for the Liberation of Angola, the FNLA. Established in 1962, it was based in the north and drew on support from the Bakongo, Angola's third largest ethnic group. Meanwhile, in 1966, the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, UNITA, was formed. Based in central and southern Angola, this represented the Ovimbundu, the country's largest ethnic group. As a result, by the late 1960s, the war had intensified as the three major nationalist groups fought to end Portuguese colonial rule. However, despite the escalating human and economic costs of the conflict, the military administration, then in power in Portugal, refused to give up control of Angola. That was until April 1974. Following a left-wing military coup that overthrew the regime in what's known as the Carnation Revolution, Portugal began a rapid process of decolonisation. Just 18 months later, on the 11th of November 1975, Angola became independent. I hope you're finding this useful. If so, please do give it a like and perhaps subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks so much, and now back to the video. While Portugal's departure was hailed as a significant step forward for Angola, any hopes that it would lead to a bright new future were short-lived. From the very start, the country was deeply divided. In November 1975, the MPLA, led by Agostinho Neto, declared itself the government of the People's Republic of Angola. However, its effective control was limited to the capital, Luanda. Elsewhere, the FNLA and UNITA had seized effective control of what they respectively called the Democratic Republic of Angola and the Social Democratic Republic of Angola. As Moscow backed the MPLA, its Caribbean ally, Cuba, soon began sending thousands of troops to support the Luanda government. All this saw the MPLA make rapid headway across the country. Faced with these advances, the FNLA and UNITA now received support from the United States and nearby apartheid South Africa, both of which were determined to stop the spread of communism in southern Africa. But despite this international backing, the FNLA was soon forced to retreat into neighbouring Congo, then known as Zaire, where it ceased to be an effective military force. Instead, the conflict now became centred on the Western and South African-backed UNITA and the Soviet and Cuban-supported MPLA. By the start of the 1980s, the MPLA, now led by José Eduardo dos Santos, controlled much of Angola. But as intense fighting continued, the first attempts to resolve the conflict began. In 1984, the sides signed the Lusaka Accords. Although this led to a ceasefire and envisaged the withdrawal of South African forces, the two sides soon disagreed over the terms of the deal. As a result, the agreement had collapsed by May 1985, and fighting resumed. Ultimately, it would be another 3 years before things began to change in earnest. In 1988, following a 7-month battle between the sides and their foreign backers, one of the largest and most significant confrontations in modern African history, new talks began. Against the backdrop of thawing superpower tensions and the gradual end of the Cold War, the UN was able to broker another deal, the so-called Tripartite Accord. As South Africa agreed to pull out of Angola and end its colonial control over neighbouring Namibia, which gained independence in March 1990, Cuba also agreed to withdraw its forces from Angola. While the era of foreign intervention was now over and the Cold War had come to an end, the fighting nevertheless continued between the MPLA and UNITA. But things were beginning to change. After decades of conflict, Angola was devastated. As well as the vast loss of life, millions had been forced to flee their homes and the country's infrastructure and economy lay in ruins. As a result, in 1991, the sides signed another peace agreement, the Bicesse Accords, which paved the way for national elections. But again, hopes for peace proved to be short-lived. While the MPLA claimed victory, UNITA argued that the vote had been rigged and fighting again resumed. But while another deal, the Lusaka Protocol, followed in 1994, this too soon collapsed, plunging the country back into its full-scale civil war. By the end of the 1990s, and following several peace attempts, the sides were under growing international pressure to end their 25-year conflict. This included UN-imposed sanctions on UNITA, which had turned to mining diamonds to fund its campaign. Despite this, the organisation vowed to continue the fight. In the end, though, the critical turning point came in February 2002 when Jonas Savimbi, the long-standing leader of UNITA, was killed in battle. From there, things rapidly changed as the remaining UNITA leaders gave up the fight. 2 months later, in April 2002, the group signed a ceasefire agreement with the MPLA government, thus ending the Angolan Civil War. The legacy of the fighting was, of course, huge. The 27-year civil war, which had followed over a decade and a half of conflict against Portuguese colonial rule, had devastated the country. Most crucially, it had an enormous effect on the population. It's estimated that up to 1 million people were killed in the fighting. Meanwhile, millions more were wounded or displaced. Even after the war ended, the human effects continue to be felt and are still profoundly shaping the country, as several generations grew up knowing nothing but war. This left the population highly traumatised, despite reconciliation efforts. Meanwhile, the country is still littered with landmines. Aside from the continuing threat to life, this also hinders the development of farming. On top of this, the war affected almost every other aspect of life in Angola. Nearly 3 decades of conflict left a shattered economy and destroyed infrastructure. Yet, things have since improved. Since the war's end, Angola has experienced impressive economic growth as its oil industry has boomed. However, as many observers point out, the effects of this have been uneven. While certain areas have profited enormously, much of the country still remains underdeveloped. Meanwhile, although UNITA became an established political party after the agreement, it hasn't been able to gain power. Instead, the MPLA continues to dominate Angolan politics. Indeed, while Dos Santos eventually stood down in 2017 after 38 years in power, he was succeeded as president by João Lourenço, another senior MPLA official. More to the point, Angola continues to be plagued by allegations of authoritarianism and corruption. For instance, Freedom House ranks the country as not free, scoring just 28 out of 100 on its index. But looked at more generally, Angola was one of the best examples of how the Cold War, a confrontation we often tend to think of as a non-militarised conflict between the superpowers, in fact played out as armed conflicts in many other parts of the world, often at the cost of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of lives. While the decades of war in Angola had a huge impact on Africa and international relations more generally, here are some videos on other conflicts that have shaped the modern global system.